The millionaire's twin daughters simply couldn't sleep. The fear of loneliness stole every night in the mansion, but one night, arriving home, he notices the absolute silence. With a racing heart, he goes up to the girls' room, and upon opening the door, he encounters such an unexpected scene that makes his heart beat stronger than ever. The sound of a picture frame shattering upstairs was the last straw. Richard "Rick" Miller, a man whose fortune was built on the cold logic of the stock market and the surgical precision of his investments, felt a vein throb in his temple. He could predict the fluctuations of the cryptocurrency market, manage a global dollar-based portfolio spanning continents, and discuss stock returns with enviable calm, but he couldn't enforce peace inside his own home. The mansion, with its marble corridors that echoed every footstep and its massive windows framing a perfectly manicured lawn, was more a mausoleum than a dwelling. At night, every draft sounded like a lament, every shadow danced like a ghost, and for his 5-year-old twin daughters, Lila and Lucy, it was a haunted castle. The crying, the screams, and the slamming doors had become the soundtrack to his evenings, a constant reminder of his most personal and painful failure. Yet another nanny, the 12th, had quit that morning, nerves shredded and with a look of pity directed at him. "They need something I can't provide, Mr. Miller," she had said, and the phrase echoed in his mind like a bad omen. Exhausted, he descended the stairs, the weight of the world on his shoulders. His businesses flourished, his capital multiplied, but his daughters' joy was fading. In the living room, the last candidate of the day awaited him. He had almost dismissed her unseen, too weary for another interview doomed to fail, but something made him stop. She was young, perhaps in her early 20s, and her simple clothes stood out starkly against the room's oppressive luxury. Her name was Elena. Her hands rested in her lap with a serenity that seemed out of place. There was no expensive paper resume, just a simple sheet with basic information, no advanced degrees, no references from Silicon Valley or Manhattan families. But when she lifted her eyes, he saw it. There was a sweetness in her brown eyes, a depth that seemed to understand pain and solace, a calm that made him breathe deeply for the first time all day. He asked the routine questions, expecting rehearsed answers, but she replied with unnerving sincerity, speaking of her small town back home, how she had cared for her younger siblings, and how she had learned lullabies from her grandmother. There was no technique, only experience. It was an absurd gamble. His advisors, his housekeeper, everyone would tell him it was a mistake, a risk to the girls. Security. A multi-millionaire like him couldn't afford to be so reckless, but the image of Lila and Lucy, faces streaked with tears, superseded all logic. What more did he have to lose? The nights were already hell. "The job is yours," he said, his voice firmer than he felt. "You start tonight." The surprise in Elena's eyes was genuine, followed by a glimmer of gratitude that disarmed him. She merely nodded, a shy smile touching her lips. In that instant, as he dismissed her to prepare, Rick felt a chill. Beside him, his loyal housekeeper, Esther, shook her head discreetly, disapproval clear on her face. He ignored her and looked out the window, night falling over his fortress of wealth and solitude. Upstairs, one of the twins began to cry again, a sharp, desperate sound. Had he just hired the solution to his chaos, or simply added a new, naive pawn to the chessboard of his imminent failure? Stepping out for his meeting, Rick left behind more than a noisy mansion. He left a fragile thread of hope he barely dared admit. He handed Elena a phone with his number and the pediatrician's, the instructions short and impersonal. As if closing another of his countless business deals, the housekeeper, Esther, a woman who managed the house with the efficiency of a general in the field, watched the scene with crossed arms. "They aren't easy, miss. None of them lasted," she said, her tone not malicious, but reflecting a weariness that mirrored her employer's. Elena simply smiled, a small but resolute gesture. "I'll do my best," she replied, and her voice did not waver. When the front door closed and the sound of the luxury car's engine faded into the night, the silence that followed was heavy, filled with the expectation of imminent chaos. Elena climbed the stairs, her heart beating a serene rhythm against her anxiety. The sound of crying guided her. Opening the girl's bedroom door, she found a war zone. Toys were scattered across the floor, a plush lamp lay askew, and the two small figures stood on their beds, faces red and wet with tears. "Get out!" cried Lila, the more temperamental of the two. "We don't want you here," finished Lucy, her voice choked with sobs. Elena neither retreated nor advanced. She simply closed the door behind her with a soft click and leaned against it, observing the storm. She didn't try to argue, didn't offer candy, didn't make empty promises. She remained silent, her gaze conveying a calm the girls didn't expect. Gradually, the screams subsided, replaced by breathless distrust. It was then that Elena slowly walked to the old rocking chair in the corner of the room, sitting down as if she had all the time in the world. And instead of speaking, she began to hum. It was an ancient melody, without words, a lullaby her grandmother used to sing while mending clothes on the porch of a simple house, miles away from all this wealth. The tune was soft, almost a whisper, and intertwined with the sound of the rain beginning to tap against the window pane. Lila and Lucy stopped, their curious little eyes fixed on her. What was this? It wasn't an order, it wasn't a plea, it was just a sound that seemed to envelop the room and soothe the shadows in the corners. After a few minutes, Eleanor stopped humming and began to speak, her voice low, as if telling a secret only to herself. "Back where I grew up, the sky held 1,000,000 more stars, and there's one, the brightest, we call the guiding star. My grandmother used to say it looked after the dreams of good children. She wasn't looking directly at them, but at the window, as if she could see the star through the clouds. The girls, silent for the first time in hours, slowly climbed down from their beds. Their bare feet barely made a sound on the plush carpet. They didn't approach, but stood motionless in the middle of the room, attentive, two miniature statues, their anger replaced by childish curiosity. Eleanor continued her story, speaking of a stream, of lightning bugs that looked like fairies, and a beautiful weeping willow tree that flowered in the spring. She painted with words a world so different from this one, a world without the burden of luxury and absence. She wasn't trying to calm them. She was offering them a refuge in the form of a story. Across town, Rick could barely focus on the profit charts and dividends. His mind kept returning to the fragile figure he had left behind. He checked his watch. It was late. The meeting dragged on, and when he finally returned home, a profound silence greeted him. A silence that wasn't exhaustion after battle, but something else, something peaceful. He climbed the stairs, heart pounding, expecting to find Elena sitting in the living room, defeated like the others, but she wasn't there. With utmost care, he turned the knob of his daughter's door and pushed it open just a crack. What he saw made him freeze. The scene was so impossible that for a moment he thought he was dreaming. There, bathed in the soft glow of a small lamp, was Eleanor, asleep in the armchair, and nestled against her, one on each side. Sleeping the deepest sleep he had ever witnessed were Lila and Lucy, their small hands clutching the fabric of her simple dress as if it were the safest anchor in the world. Rick backed away, closing the door with infinite care, as if a noise could break the enchantment of the scene. He didn't go to his own room. Instead, he descended to the study, the sanctuary where he turned capital into more capital, where the world was reduced to numbers and market projections. He sat in his leather armchair, but didn't turn on the computer. The image of that triple embrace was burned into his retina, an anomaly in his perfectly calculated universe. How had she done it? Child psychologists, pedagogues with impeccable resumes. They all failed. And this young woman, with nothing but lullabies and stories of lightning bugs, had brought silence. Not the tense silence from before, but a palpable peace that seemed to have infiltrated the cracks and calmed the mansion's very ghosts. He, a man who had accumulated vast wealth, who understood assets and liabilities, felt he was facing a phenomenon he couldn't quantify. That peace was priceless, yet it was undoubtedly the most valuable commodity his house had known in years. The next morning, the difference was audible. There was no crying, only the low sound of giggling coming from the dining room. When Rick walked in, Lila and Lucy were sitting at the table, not with their usual scowls, but with their hair clumsily braided, drawing on napkins. Elena was beside them, serving juice, humming the same melody from the night before. Seeing him, the girls didn't shrink away. Lila, the most reserved, held up her drawing. "It's the guiding star," she said, with childish seriousness. Rick looked at the yellow scribble on the paper and felt a lump form in his throat. He simply nodded, a gesture that meant more to him than closing a major deal. Esther, the housekeeper, observed everything from the kitchen doorway, her face a mask of neutrality that failed to hide her surprise. Later, while Rick was having his coffee, she approached. They slept through the night. "Not a peep," she said, as if reporting a miracle. "But, Mr. Miller, people are talking. Such a simple girl, no references. The last nanny had a degree from a Swiss finishing school." Rick looked into his cup. "The last nanny lasted 1 week. Esther." "I know, sir, but your position, your wealth, it attracts all sorts of people. You must be careful." The warning hung in the air, a reminder of the world outside, a world that judged by appearances, by diplomas, by net worth. He spent the day in his home office, cancelling meetings. He wanted to watch. He wanted to understand. Through the window, he saw Elena in the garden with the girls. They weren't playing with expensive toys, but with dry leaves and twigs, building a small makeshift fort, and they were laughing. A genuine, loud laugh that the wind carried up to him. A sound that all his money couldn't buy. He realized he hadn't heard his daughters laugh like that since before. Before everything. Before the absence that hung over them. That afternoon, as he passed through the hallway, he heard Lucy's voice coming from the bedroom. "Did Mum like stars too?" The question was a whisper. Rick froze, his body rigid. He expected awkward silence or an evasive answer, but he heard Eleanor's voice, soft as velvet. "I'm sure she did. I think she turned into the most beautiful star of all, just so she could look after you from up there." A low sob from Lucy. And then, "Do you think so?" "I don't think so. I feel it." "Right here," Eleanor replied, and Rick knew, without needing to see, that she was pointing to her heart. That simple dialogue broke something inside him. Night fell again, and with it, the phone rang. It was Veronica Sinclair, a woman from his social circle, whose family possessed a fortune comparable to his. Her voice was syrupy, but with a hint of steel. "Rick, darling, we're hosting a dinner on Saturday. You simply must come." He invented an excuse. But she insisted, her tones subtly shifting. "I heard you hired a new nanny. I heard she's a rather common girl. I'm just calling as a friend, darling. With a portfolio like yours, you need to protect yourself from opportunists. You never know people's true intentions." The word opportunist echoed in Rick's mind long after he hung up the phone. Veronica, with her calculated elegance and friendship coated in self-interest, represented the voice of the world he belonged to. A world where every move was scrutinized, every association weighed on a scale of status and profit. A billionaire like him, widowed with 2 young daughters, was a target. He knew it. His life was a fortress built to protect his assets, his inheritance, and most importantly, his children. And Elena, with her disarming simplicity, was the unexpected breach in that wall. Would it be naive of him to believe she was just what she appeared to be? doubt, like a weed, began to sprout. That night, he returned home earlier, dismissing his driver a few blocks away and walking the rest of the way under the starry sky. The mansion was silent, peace still reigning, but now, instead of relief, he felt a stab of suspicion. He found Elena in the kitchen, preparing chamomile tea. She wore a floral apron over her simple dress, and her hair was tied back in a loose bun. She seemed to belong in that place, and yet to be from an entirely different universe. "Are the girls asleep already?" he asked, his voice more formal than intended. Elena turned, a tired but genuine smile on her face. Like angels, Lucy wanted to leave a glass of milk on the windowsill for Mommy's star. The purity of that gesture struck him, but the seed of doubt was already planted. "Elena, may we talk for a moment?" He guided her to the study, the room that was the heart of his financial empire. Global investment maps and screens displaying stock market quotes adorned the walls. It was a place of power, of intimidation. He watched her sit in the chair opposite him, hands crossed in her lap, her posture straight but showing no fear. "Your work with the girls is remarkable," he began, choosing his words carefully. "Ooh, but I need to better understand your references, your background, and you understand, given my position, security is paramount." Elena's smile faded, replaced by an expression of contained hurt. "I understand, Mr. Miller. I don't have a resume like the others. My only reference is the life I've lived. I took care of my 4 younger siblings while my mother worked the fields. I know what a high fever feels like in the middle of the night and what it takes to calm a nightmare. I know the best medicine for fear is a hug, not an expensive toy." Her sincerity was like a punch. He expected hesitation, perhaps a well-told lie, but received only the stark truth. "And why did you come to the city? What are you seeking here?" he pressed, feeling like an inquisitor. "A better life, a chance to help my family. My youngest brother, he needs expensive medical treatment. The money I earn here is for him." The revelation caught him by surprise. It wasn't ambition for luxury or wealth, but a family necessity, an act of altruism. The doubt in his chest began to dissipate, replaced by an uncomfortable shame. He had been judging this woman by the standards of a cynical world she didn't even know. In the days that followed, the external pressure mounted. A Society columnist published a veiled note about the reclusive billionaire and his mysterious new protégé. Veronica called frequently, offering to introduce more suitable candidates. Each phone call, each comment was a small blow to his conviction. He found himself divided. On one side, the peace of his daughters, the laughter that had returned to fill the house. On the other, the weight of his name, the responsibility of his assets, and the incessant voice of society warning him of danger. One afternoon, he heard raised voices coming from the service entrance. Approaching, he saw Eleanor arguing with a rough-looking young man with a desperate glint in his eye. "I already gave you what I had, Daniel. You need to be patient," she said, her voice trembling. "Patience doesn't pay debts, Elena. Those guys are threatening me. You're here, in this mansion full of gold, and I'm hanging by a thread. Ask your rich boss for an advance." The young man, her brother, looked over her shoulder and saw Rick standing in the hall, watching. The young man's gaze was a mix of envy and defiance. In that instant, Elena's world collided with Rick's in the most brutal way possible. The precariousness of her origin, the secret she kept, was now exposed under the cold lights of his mansion. And he, the man who controlled fortunes, faltered. Veronica's warning about opportunists and people's true intentions came back with full force. Could it have all been a plan? Was her kindness just a facade to solve her family's financial problems using his money? The silence that followed Daniel's hurried departure was heavier than any shout. Elena stood in the corridor, her face pale, feeling Rick's gaze on her like a physical weight. Shame consumed her. It was as if the plaster walls and expensive artwork could see right through her, exposing the poverty and problems she had fought so hard to leave behind. She was no longer the miracle nanny, the child whisperer. She was just a fraud, a woman with an indebted brother knocking at her door. Ricky, meanwhile, felt an analytical coldness take over. It was the same feeling he had when evaluating a high-risk investment. His business instinct, the same one that had made him a multi-millionaire, screamed at him to pull back, reassess the facts, cut the liabilities. His daughter's happiness was the profit, but Elena's family drama was an unforeseen risk, a variable that could compromise his entire portfolio of tranquility. "My office now," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth. Elena followed him, each step a torment. She sat again in the leather chair, but this time there was no serenity in her posture. She felt like a defendant in a courtroom. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Miller," she began, her voice a thread. "My brother, he's not a bad person, just desperate. I never wanted to bring my problems into your home." Rick opened a drawer and pulled out a checkbook. That was his language, the way he solved problems. Money. How much does he need? The question was direct, transactional. He wasn't offering help. He was trying to buy a solution, quantify the problem to eliminate it. To his surprise, Elena shook her head, the tears she had been holding back finally running down her face. "No, I can't accept." "Why not? Wouldn't this resolve the situation?" he insisted, his suspicion growing. An opportunist wouldn't refuse money, or perhaps it was a more elaborate strategy. "It would resolve it for now, but it wouldn't change anything," she said, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "I don't want your money, sir. I want my salary. I came here to work, to earn my things through my own effort. If I accept, I'll only be confirming what people like your friend Veronica think of me." The mention of Veronica struck him. He hadn't known she had spoken to Elena. That small detail changed the dynamic. It wasn't just him and his doubt. It was the pressure of his world invading hers. He put the checkbook away, feeling strangely defeated. Later that night, the mansion was quiet, but it was a tense quiet. Rick passed by the girls' room and saw Elena sitting on the floor between the two beds. She wasn't telling a story. She was simply there, present, while Lila and Lucy slept. The light from the lamp illuminated her face, and he could see the dry tear tracks on her cheeks. She looked incredibly lonely, an island of sadness amidst all the luxury surrounding her. He retreated unseen and went to his study. He looked at the screens flickering with stock market numbers, the graphs representing the ascent of his fortune. All of it was logical, predictable, but human emotion was a volatile market he was unprepared for. He wanted to believe her in the purity of her gestures, but the fear of being deceived, of exposing his daughters to yet another disappointment, was paralyzing. His entire life had been built on the premise of avoiding unnecessary risks, of protecting his assets. And Elena, with her complicated past and her unwavering dignity, was the most incomprehensible risk of all. The ring of his cell phone jolted him from his thoughts. It was an unknown number, but he answered, "Mr. Miller, this is the Metropolitan Daily. We'd like a comment on the photo we received. The proposed caption is, 'The billionaire's risky new asset, nanny with family baggage, hits the mansion's doorstep. Do you have anything to declare?'" Rick felt his blood run cold. On the other end of the line, the journalist sent the image to his cell phone. The photo was grainy, taken from a distance, but unmistakable. Eleanor, her desperate brother, and the imposing facade of the mansion as the backdrop. The scandal was no longer a possibility. It was a news story about to be printed. The photo on Rick's phone was a grenade about to explode. Every pixel screamed scandal, a toxic mix of wealth, poverty, and desperation, the kind of story sensationalist media devoured. His first reaction was that of the strategist, the man who controlled narratives in the business world. He needed to contain the damage, protect his privacy, and smother the story before it became an uncontrollable fire. "I have no comment, and if you publish this, my legal department will be in contact," he said, his voice cold as ice, and ended the call. But the damage was already done. The threat had been planted. Someone was watching them. Someone wanted to expose Elena's fragility, and by extension, his own. He looked from the phone screen to the silent hallway, toward the girl's room. Whom was he trying to protect? His reputation, or the woman who had brought peace to his daughters? The distinction, once so clear, was now blurred. The next day, the atmosphere in the mansion was almost unbearable. Elena tried to maintain the routine, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. She knew something had changed, that Rick's gaze now carried the weight of suspicion and calculation. He, in turn, was distant, trapped in phone calls with his lawyers, discussing crisis containment strategies. The word liability was frequently used, a corporate term for a deeply human problem. Veronica, sensing opportunity, showed up at the mansion uninvited, under the pretext of bringing a gift for the girls. She found Eleanor in the garden, and her gaze swept over her with thinly veiled contempt. "Darling, a piece of advice from someone who's lived in this world longer," she began, her voice a sweet poison. "People like us and people like you don't mix. It only causes trouble. Rick is an important man with a fortune to protect. He can't have his image associated with small-town drama." Eleanor felt every word like a slap. She lifted her chin, dignity her only armor. "I am not a scandal, Ms. Sinclair. I am a person. Of course you are, dear, but to the world you are a risk. Think of the girls. They don't deserve to have their lives exposed because of your problems." Veronica smiled triumphantly and walked away, leaving Elena alone with the cruel truth of her words. Fear began to settle in Elena's heart. It wasn't fear for herself, but for the children. She had come to this house to bring them security, and now she was the source of the threat. Her presence, once a balm, had become a poison. Perhaps Veronica was right. Perhaps the best thing she could do for Lila and Lucy was to disappear. That night was different. Rick, exhausted and frustrated, arrived home early. He didn't go to the study. He went to the playroom, a room he rarely visited. The sound drew him in. It was Elena's voice, but she wasn't telling a story. She was teaching the girls an old song, one of those nursery rhymes that seemed to have existed forever. The melody was simple, but Lila and Lucy's laughter filled it with contagious joy. He stood still in the doorway, hidden in the shadows. He watched Elena scoop them both up in an awkward hug, the three of them spinning slowly in the middle of the room, singing and laughing. In that instant, there was no billionaire, no nanny, no problems. There was only a glimpse of a family, a glimpse of what he had lost and what perhaps, just perhaps, he could have again. When the laughter ceased and the girls yawned, Elena led them to their room. Rick waited for her in the living room. When she came down, the exhaustion visible on her face, he spoke. "I saw you in the playroom." Eleanor just nodded, unsure what to expect. "They haven't laughed like that in a long time," he continued, his voice low, almost a confession. "They love you, Elena." The look they exchanged was fraught with a tension neither of them could name. It was more than a boss-employee relationship. It was a silent acknowledgement of their importance in the life of this broken family. His hand rose, an almost involuntary movement, to touch her face, to brush back a lock of hair that had fallen over her eyes. The touch was light, a brushing of fingers, but an electric current passed between them. Eleanor held her breath, her heart racing. Rick pulled his hand back as if he had touched fire, surprised by his own impulse. Both stood silent, the space between them vibrating with the unsaid. The fear and insecurity were still there, but something new had been born in that touch. A fragile, terrifying connection, and the question hanging in the air was more dangerous than any scandal. What would happen if they allowed themselves to feel? That night, the sky fell. A violent storm hit the city, with winds that howled and shook the centennial trees in the garden as if they were mere shrubs. Rain lashed against the mansion windows, and thunder boomed, making the luxurious structure seem fragile and vulnerable. The touch of hands, that moment of contained electricity between Rick and Elena in the living room, seemed like a premonition of nature's fury. Each retreated to their quarters, but sleep did not come. The air was charged, not just with electricity, but with an emotional tension neither could dissipate. Near midnight, a different sound cut through the storm's roar. It wasn't a cry of fear from the dark, but a low, feverish moan. Elena heard it first. She leaped out of bed, heart pounding, and ran to the girl's room. Lucy was curled up under the duvet, her body trembling, her skin burning with fever. Lila slept soundly beside her, oblivious to the drama unfolding. Elena acted on instinct. She grabbed a towel, dampened it with cool water, and began applying it to the girl's forehead, whispering words of comfort. It was the sound of her hurried steps that woke Rick. He found the scene in the bedroom. Elena, her face lined with worry, trying to bring down his daughter's fever, who was now whimpering continuously. Panic, a feeling he rarely experienced in his business dealings, overwhelmed him. He, the man who remained calm while millions of dollars changed hands, felt utterly helpless before his daughter's fragility. "I'll call Dr. Matos," he said, grabbing his cell phone. But the storm had knocked out the lines. There was no signal. "The roads must be flooded. No one will be able to get here," Elena said, her voice steady despite the situation. "We need to bring her temperature down." The next few hours were a blur of despair for Rick and focused action for Eleanor. He paced back and forth, feeling useless, a spectator in his own home. All his fortune, all his assets, his investments in gold and cryptocurrency, none of it served to alleviate his daughter's suffering. They were just empty numbers compared to the reality of a small, feverish body. Elena, on the other hand, was the personification of calm and competence. She didn't leave Lucy's side for a second. She prepared an herbal tea Esther kept in the kitchen, changed the cold compresses with infinite patience, and held the girl's small hand, singing in an almost inaudible whisper. Rick just watched, admiration and fear battling in his chest. He didn't see an employee, but a force of nature, a guardian. The fever did not break. Lucy began to drift into delirium, calling out for storybook characters, her little eyes glazed and lost. It was the moment of greatest panic for Rick. He knelt by the bed, his face a mask of anguish. "Do something," he whispered to Eleanor, his voice cracking. "I'm doing everything I know how," she replied, her eyes tear-filled, but her hand firm on the girl's forehead. And then, at the height of the delirium, Lucy calmed for an instant. Her eyes focused on Elena's face, who was leaning over her. A tear rolled down the corner of her eye, and in a weak voice, a breath of sound almost lost in the roar of the thunder outside, she said the word that would change everything, "Mommy." Time stopped. The word hung in the air, small, but with the weight of a seismic revelation. Rick abruptly raised his head, his gaze fixed on Eleanor, his heart beating wildly. Elena froze, shock etched on her face. A single silent tear rolled down her cheek. She looked at Rick, her eyes wide, a mix of dread and an emotion so profound it had no name, as if she had crossed a border from which there was no return. The word "mommy," spoken by Lucy's frail, feverish voice, did not dissipate with the sound of the storm. It lingered in the room, altering the composition of the air, redefining the invisible boundaries that existed between Rick, Elena, and the children. It was a catalyst, a moment that exposed the depth of the void the young nanny had filled without anyone, not even herself, realizing it. Rick felt as if the ground had been ripped out from under him. That word, so loaded with longing and absence, was a taboo in that house. The girls rarely spoke it, as if afraid to touch a wound that never healed. And now, Lucy delivered it to Elena, not out of confusion, but from pure instinct, a search for the source of security and comfort in her moment of greatest vulnerability. He looked at Elena, whose face reflected a whirlwind of emotions. There was compassion, shock, and an overwhelming fear of having gone too far, of having occupied a space that didn't belong to her. The tears welling up in her eyes were not of joy, but of a deep awareness of the gravity of the moment. The storm outside began to abate at dawn, as did Lucy's fever. The girl finally fell asleep, her breathing calmer, her skin less hot. Elena, exhausted, remained in the armchair beside the bed, her eyes fixed on the sleeping child. Rick silently left the room and went to the balcony. The air was clean and cold after the rain. He watched the sun rising, painting the sky with colors he hadn't noticed in years. Lucy's call forced him to confront a truth he had been avoiding. Elena was no longer just an employee. She had become the emotional center of his family. It wasn't a matter of salary or duties. It was about the way she looked at his daughters, as if their pain were her own. It was about the songs that filled the silence and the stories that chased away the night monsters. It was about the feeling of home she had brought with her, something all his capital and assets couldn't create. The crisis of the previous night stripped him bare of his certainties. He, the billionaire who controlled an empire, realized that the most indispensable person in his life was not one of his executives or financial consultants, but this young woman of humble origin, and this dependence frightened him as much as it attracted him. In the following days, a new dynamic, delicate and unverbalized, settled in the house. Rick began to subtly change his routines. He spent less time locked in the study and more time in the common areas of the house. He didn't interfere, but he observed. He watched Elena teach the girls to bake cookies in the kitchen, dusting the impeccable marble with flour. And instead of getting annoyed by the mess, he felt a pang of something akin to happiness. He listened to the three of them talking in the garden and caught himself smiling alone. The relationship between him and Elena also changed. There was a new awareness between them. Gazes lingered a little longer. Conversations, previously strictly about the children, now drifted to personal topics. He asked about her hometown. She asked about a book he was reading. They were small steps into unknown territory, each afraid of making a false move. One night, he found her in the library, flipping through an atlas. "I always wanted to see the world," she said, almost in a whisper, as if confessing a forbidden dream. "Which place would you like to see first?" he asked, approaching. "A place with a really blue ocean, back where I grew up. We only had muddy rivers." He stood beside her, so close he could smell the faint lavender scent emanating from her hair. "I can take you anywhere in the world," he said, his voice lower than planned. The offer hung between them, loaded with possibilities. It wasn't a proposal from an employer, but from a man. Elena raised her eyes from the book, and for an instant, the barrier of insecurity and fear dissolved. She saw in him not the multimillionaire, but a lonely man, just as lost as she was. "I know you can," she replied softly, "but it's not the same as going on your own." The gentle refusal was an assertion of her independence, her dignity, and that, to Rick, was more attractive than any acceptance. He was used to getting everything he wanted with his money, but her integrity was an asset that wasn't for sale. The subtle shift in the mansion's dynamic did not escape Esther. The housekeeper, with her eagle eyes and unwavering loyalty to Rick, observed the growing proximity between her employer and the nanny with almost maternal concern. She saw the way Rick's eyes followed Eleanor across the room, the way he smiled hearing the girl's laughter mixed with her voice. And she also saw Eleanor's hesitation, the way she pulled back whenever the interaction became too personal, as if an invisible force was pulling her back into her place. Esther was not driven by malice, like Veronica. but by a protective instinct. She knew the pain Rick had faced, and how fragile he was beneath his billionaire armor. She feared that a new emotional involvement, especially with someone from such a different world, could lead to more suffering. And above all, she feared for the girls. They had already lost one mother. Another loss, even of a figure who had become maternal, would be devastating. The external pressure, far from diminishing, found a new target. Veronica, realizing that her direct warnings to Rick had no effect, changed tactics. She began spreading the story more widely, but with a new and cruel twist. At lunches with influential friends and in casual conversations at charity events, she painted a picture of Elena not as a simple opportunist, but as a cunning manipulator. "It's sad, really," she would say, with false compassion. "The poor girl, obviously desperate, is using the children. They say she's encouraging them to call her mommy, to create an emotional leash and trap Rick. It's an old strategy, but unfortunately, it still works on fragile men." The gossip, venomous and well-aimed, spread like wildfire. Soon, Elena's image shifted from the humble nanny to the manipulative schemer. The rumor reached Rick's ears through one of his business partners, who approached him cautiously. "Rick, people are talking. Be careful. Your reputation in the business world depends on your image of stability. A personal scandal can affect investor confidence in your funds." The warning hit Rick where it hurt most, his pride and his control. He hated being the subject of conversation, hated having his personal life dissected by social vultures, and as much as he wanted to ignore it, doubt crept back in. Had Lucy's call on that feverish night been spontaneous or subtly induced, the idea was repugnant, but the poison of gossip was effective. He found himself observing Elena with different eyes, looking for signs of manipulation, for any hint of falsehood. But all he found was the same dedication, the same genuine affection. The tension within him was excruciating. His heart told him to trust the woman who had saved his family, but his mind, trained to identify risks and threats to his assets, was on high alert. The internal conflict manifested in his behavior. He became more distant, more formal. The moments of near intimacy in the library or the living room were replaced by strictly professional communication. Elena felt the change immediately. The warmth had been replaced by subtle ice. She didn't understand why, but the pain of rejection was acute. She felt like she was walking a tightrope, and every day the wind of Rick's disapproval threatened to knock her down. The situation reached a critical point during a small birthday party for one of the girls' schoolmates. Rick, feeling the pressure to maintain appearances, took his daughters. Veronica was there, radiant. At one point, while the children were playing, she approached Lila. "Your new nanny is very nice, isn't she, dear? Does she let you call her mommy?" The question was delivered with a sweet smile, but it was a trap. Little Lila, with the innocence of her 5 years, replied, "Elena is our friend. Mommy turned into a star." The answer disarmed Veronica's malice, but Rick, who overheard the conversation from a distance, felt a chill. The gossip was not just a distant rumor. It was knocking on his door, trying to contaminate his daughters, and he, paralyzed by doubt and pride, didn't know how to fight it. The birthday party marked the beginning of a cold war inside the mansion. Rick, haunted by Veronica's audacity and consumed by doubt, erected a wall of formality between himself and Elena. He convinced himself it was the right course of action, a protective measure. By maintaining distance, he would be protecting himself from possible deceit and, in a way, the girls from an attachment that could end in pain. For Elena, Rick's silence and coldness were a form of torture. Every formal good morning, every instruction given through Esther was a reminder that the fragile bridge they had begun to build had collapsed. She felt judged for a crime she hadn't committed, but had no way to defend herself against accusations never spoken aloud. Her only joy was the time she spent with Lila and Lucy, a refuge of purity amidst the growing tension. The girls, with their childish sensitivity, noticed the change. "Is Daddy mad at you?" Lucy asked one day, her eyes wide and worried. Elena forced a smile and hugged her. "No, my angel. Daddy just has a lot of work, important business to take care of." But the excuse sounded hollow even to her. The situation became untenable when the former hopeful decided to intensify her attack. Veronica knew that rumors were effective but slow. She needed something more concrete, something that would force Rick's hand. Using her considerable fortune and influence, she hired a private investigator to dig into Elena's past. The result was exactly what she expected. Her brother, Daniel, had a long record of gambling debts and petty offenses. It was the perfect ammunition. Veronica orchestrated her plan with a general's precision. She forged emails, creating a false exchange between an anonymous address and Elena's personal email, which she obtained through a contact. In the forged messages, Elena appeared to be coordinating with her brother how to extort money from Rick. The plan was detailed. Use the girl's attachment as leverage, feign a family emergency, and ask for a large sum as a loan. To make it all more believable, Veronica included details about Rick's habits and the house routine, information she herself knew well. With the evidence in hand, she prepared the final blow. On a night when she knew Rick would be alone in his study, she visited him, her face a mask of concern and urgency. "Rick, I didn't want to be the bearer of bad news, but as your friend, I can't stay silent," she said, handing him an envelope. "I received this from an anonymous source. I think you need to see it." Rick opened the envelope and read the copies of the emails. Every word was a stab to his already shaken trust. The mention of his wealth, the cynical use of the girls as emotional investment, the plan to simulate a crisis for profit, it all fit perfectly into the narrative society had already created. It was confirmation of his worst fear. The ingenuousness was a facade, the sweetness a tool, the love for the girls a business strategy. The pain he felt was sharp, a mix of betrayal and self-anger for having been so foolish. In that moment, he wasn't the calculating billionaire. He was just a man whose heart, which had begun to open again, had been trampled. He didn't question the authenticity of the documents. The seed of doubt planted by Veronica and watered by social pressure had grown into a poisonous tree that obscured any other possibility. When Eleanor entered the study, called by him, she found him standing, his back to the door. Looking out at the illuminated city through the panoramic window, "Mr. Miller," she called, her voice hesitant. He turned slowly. His face was devoid of all emotion, which was more terrifying than any outburst of anger. In his hand, he held the papers. "I expected more from you, Elena," he said, his voice low and cutting. "I thought you were different, but in the end, it's all about money, isn't it?" He threw the papers onto the desk. Elena approached and picked up the first sheet. Her eyes scanned the lines, and the blood drained from her face. The words were cruel, calculating, and carried her name. It was a nightmare. This isn't mine. I never wrote this," she stammered, shock paralyzing her. "Please spare me your denials," he interrupted, his voice glacial. "It's all here. The plan, the greed, using my daughters. How could you?" The accusation, the injustice, was so immense that Elena's tears dried up. In their place, a cold ache and a silent resolution took hold of her. She looked into his eyes, the man she was beginning to love, and saw a stranger, a judge who had already delivered his sentence. There was nothing she could say. Her word, the only thing she truly possessed, was worth nothing against those sheets of paper. Without another word, she placed the papers back on the desk, turned, and left the study, leaving behind not just a job, but the pieces of her heart. Elena walked through the mansion's silent corridors like a ghost. Every luxury object, every work of art seemed to mock her, highlighting the chasm that had always existed between her world and Rick's. His accusation was not just a blow to her honor, it was the annihilation of the fragile hope she had secretly been nurturing. The hope that someone could see her for who she was, not for what she lacked. Her first instinct was to go to the girls' room, hug them one last time, feel the warmth of their small bodies, and memorize the scent of their hair. But she couldn't. The pain of farewell would be unbearable, and seeing them sleep peacefully, oblivious to the storm that had just destroyed their small universe, broke her in two. How could she explain that she was leaving? How could she say goodbye without them feeling abandoned once more? Leaving a note seemed the most cowardly and, at the same time, the most merciful act. In her small room, with trembling hands, she wrote. The words were simple, direct, intended not for Rick, but for the girls. It spoke of stars, of courage, and how the love she felt for them would last forever, no matter the distance. She folded the paper and left it on the pillow that, for so many nights, had been her only confidant. With a small bag containing her few belongings, she descended the stairs. Esther was in the kitchen, and seeing Eleanor with the bag, ready to leave, her tough face dissolved into an expression of genuine sadness. "Don't do this, child," the housekeeper whispered. "He's blind, but he'll regret it." "There's nothing left for me here, Esther," Elena replied, her voice choked. "Take good care of them." And with that, she opened the back door and disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind the only house that, for a brief period, had felt like home. Rick spent the night in his study, stewing over the betrayal. He read and reread the forged emails, every word reinforcing his decision. He drank expensive whiskey, but the alcohol couldn't numb the sharp pain in his chest. He told himself he had cut out a cancer, protected his most precious assets. But the feeling that dominated him was not relief, but a deep, desolate loss. Hell began the next morning. Leela and Lucy woke up and didn't find Elena. In her place was a temporary nanny, an efficient and cold woman hired through an elite agency. Panic set in immediately. "Where's Elena?" asked Lila, her voice already trembling. "Nanny Elena had to go away, sweethearts," Rick said, trying to keep his voice steady. "But she's coming back, isn't she, Daddy?" insisted Lucy, her eyes already filled with tears. Rick's evasiveness was all the answer they needed. The crying began, a dual lament that echoed through the mansion, much worse than the old cries of fear. It was a cry of abandonment, of broken hearts. They refused to eat. They rejected the new nanny, locking themselves in their room. When Rick tried to approach, they recoiled, looking at him as if he were the monster who had chased away their only source of light. It was then that he found Eleanor's note on the pillow, reading the simple, loving words to his daughters. A crack opened in his armor of certainty. There was not a single word of accusation, anger, or self-justification, only love and a painful farewell. The days that followed were the worst of his life. The mansion returned to being a haunted castle, but this time the ghosts were real. They were the ghosts of Elena's laughter, the sound of her songs, the peace she had brought. The girls were wasting away. They barely ate, didn't play, and the nights were once again filled with nightmares. The new nanny, despite her impeccable qualifications, was useless. Lila and Lucy didn't want her. They wanted Eleanor. One night, exhausted and desperate, Rick entered their room and found them awake, huddled together in bed, looking out the window. "We're looking for Mom's star," whispered Lucy. "But I think Elena took all the stars with her." That sentence, spoken with the cruel wisdom of childhood, finally broke Rick. He sat on the floor, the weight of his mistake crushing him. What had he done? In the name of protecting his assets, his pride, his reputation, he had destroyed his daughter's happiness and expelled the only person who had made them truly smile. He looked at the fake emails, still in his pocket, and for the first time saw them clearly. The language, the tone, the malice. It wasn't Elena's. It was Veronica's. The realization hit him with the force of a punch. He hadn't been deceived by Eleanor, but by his own world, by his own distrust. And the price of his error was the suffering of the two people he loved most. The revelation fell upon Rick not as a soft light, but as a bolt of lightning, annihilating the structure of pride and fear he had built around himself, his daughter's silent suffering, Lucy's devastating phrase about the stars, the rereading of the emails with finally opened eyes, all converged into a single, undeniable truth. He had made the biggest mistake of his life. It hadn't been an investment miscalculation, a stock market crash, or a botched deal. It had been a mistake of the heart, a mistake of faith, and its consequences were not measured in dollars or euros, but in the silent tears of his daughters. In that moment of overwhelming clarity, the billionaire gave way to the father. The fortune, the net worth, the comments of high society all became insignificant background noise. The only thing that mattered was the pain in Lila and Lucy's eyes and the unbearable void Elena's absence had left. He rose from the floor of the girls' room, driven by an urgency he hadn't felt in years. There was no time to waste on regret. He had to act. He called his head of security, a discreet and efficient man. "I need you to find Elena. Now. Check her home address, bus tickets, anything. Be discreet but fast." The search began. While his men worked, Rick did something he hadn't done in a long time. He sat on the bed with his daughters, hugged them, and let them cry. And for the first time, he cried with them, not trying to offer solutions or empty promises, but simply sharing the pain. The next day, the information arrived. Elena was in her hometown, a small locality hours away. She wasn't hiding. She had simply returned home. Rick didn't hesitate. He left the girls in Esther's reluctant care and drove himself, dismissing the driver. The long drive down the dusty road was a pilgrimage. Every mile that took him away from the luxury of his life was a mile that brought him closer to the truth. He watched the landscape change, the tall buildings giving way to green fields and simple houses. He was entering Eleanor's world. And the simplicity and honesty of that place only highlighted the injustice he had committed. The house was small, humble, with a tiny flower garden in front and laundry drying on the line. It seemed a world away from the oppressive mansion. He felt his heart pound in his throat. What would he say? How could he beg forgiveness for such a deep wound? He knocked on the door, and Elena's mother answered. A woman with a face marked by time and kind but suspicious eyes. He introduced himself, and before he could explain, Elena appeared in the room. Their eyes met, and the world seemed to stop. She was thinner, and there was a sadness in her gaze that cut him deeply. There was no anger on her face, only a profound weariness. "What are you doing here, sir?" she asked, her voice emotionless. It was then that the words he had rehearsed throughout the trip vanished. He spoke with a raw sincerity, stripped of any arrogance. "I came for you. I made a terrible mistake, Elena. I was blind, I was a fool. I believed lies because I was afraid to believe the truth. The truth is that my daughters need you. The truth is that I need you." He held out his hand, not to touch her, but as a gesture of supplication. "I don't want you back just as a nanny. I want you as part of our lives, our family. If you give me a chance, I promise to spend the rest of my life proving I am worthy of your kindness." Elena listened in silence, tears slowly streaming down her face. It was everything she had ever dreamed of hearing, but the pain of betrayal was still there. It was the sound of a car stopping that broke the moment. Esther, unable to contain the girl's desperation, had decided to follow Rick. She opened the car door, and Lila and Lucy, seeing Elena in the doorway, didn't hesitate. They ran. their small feet kicking up dust, and threw themselves into her arms with desperate force. "Elena, you came back," cried Lila. "Don't ever leave again. Please," sobbed Lucy, clinging to her neck as if their lives depended on it. And then, together, in a touching, childish chorus, the two looked up at her, their faces wet with tears, and said, "Stay with us forever." That plea, coming from the purity of his daughters' hearts, was the final absolution and calling. Elena, hugging the two girls tightly, raised her eyes to Rick. The tears now were of relief, forgiveness, and a new beginning. He approached, and before his daughters, that humble house and the blue sky of the country, he whispered, "I love you, Elena. Forgive me." The drive back was an eloquent silence. Lila and Lucy, exhausted by the emotional roller coaster, fell asleep in the back seat, nestled against Elena, their small hands firmly grasping the fabric of her dress as if to ensure she wouldn't disappear again. Rick drove, and occasionally his gaze drifted to the rearview mirror, not to check traffic, but to observe that image. The scene was the personification of peace, the resolution of all his internal conflicts. He didn't see a nanny and two children. He saw his family, whole and secure. All his fortune, his multi-million-dollar businesses, his investments in stocks and gold seemed secondary, mere props for the true wealth that now occupied his car. When they arrived at the mansion, night had already fallen. The lights, which previously seemed cold and intimidating, now shone with a welcoming warmth. Esther was waiting for them at the door, and seeing the united group, a rare, genuine smile illuminated her face. She took the sleeping girls in her arms with surprising tenderness and carried them upstairs, leaving Rick and Elena alone in the grand entrance hall. The air between them was charged, no longer with tension, but with a deep, unspoken emotion. Rick guided her to the study, the same place where he had so cruelly accused her. But this time, he didn't sit behind the imposing desk. He remained standing, vulnerable. He handed her the papers. "I want you to see this," he said. "And I want you to know that I know who did this. It was Veronica." He explained everything, the gossip, the social pressure, his own weakness, and the fear that led him to believe the lie. He didn't apologize just for what he did, but for who he was. A man so immersed in the cynicism of his world of interest and dividends that he had forgotten how to trust what was pure and true. "I spent years building an empire to protect myself from risks," he confessed, his voice thick. "But I ended up building a prison. You and the girls were the first to find a crack in that wall, and I, out of fear, tried to close it. I will never doubt you again. Elena, never." As he spoke, he took out his cell phone and, in front of her, called Veronica. The conversation was short and ruthless. He informed her that he knew everything, that any future attempt at contact would result in legal action that would destroy not only her reputation, but her family's wealth. He banished her from his life, his social circles, his businesses, with the same surgical precision he used to liquidate a bad investment. Hanging up, he felt lighter. It was the end of a chapter in his life, a farewell to the superficial world that had almost cost him everything. Elena watched him, her tears now those of understanding. She understood the pressure he was under, the weight he carried. Her forgiveness was not spoken in words, but in a gesture. She approached and, for the first time, it was she who initiated contact, taking his hand. "And about your brother," Rick continued, his voice softer. "I was wrong to offer money as if it were a simple solution, but I want to help the right way. We can arrange treatment for him, a job, a chance to start over. We'll do this together as a family." That together sealed the agreement. It was no longer him helping her, but the two of them as partners, solving the problems life presented. The final barrier between them dissolved. He pulled her into an embrace, and Elena allowed herself to rest her head on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. The mansion was silent, But it was a different kind of quiet. It was the peace that follows the storm, the calm of those who have finally found their safe harbor. The conflicts had been resolved, the wounds exposed and cleaned, the past was forgiven, and the future, previously a blank and terrifying canvas, now stretched before them, full of promises and the certainty that, no matter what came, they would face it together. The dawn that followed dispelled not only the shadows of the night, but also the ghosts that had haunted the mansion for so long. The sun, streaming through the massive windows, no longer revealed the dust of loneliness, but illuminated scenes of happy domesticity that the house had never known. The transformation was gradual and profound. The mansion, once a symbol of Rick's power and isolation, a luxurious vault to guard his wealth, began to become a home. Lila and Lucy's laughter now echoed through the marble corridors, not as a challenge to the silence, but as the house's natural soundtrack. Doors no longer slammed in anger or fear. They opened to reveal Elena teaching the girls to dance in the living room, or Rick sitting on the rug, attempting to build a block castle as complex as his cash flow statements. The nights, previously the epicenter of childhood terror, became the most anticipated time. Story time was now a family ritual. Rick, who used to arrive late and exhausted, rearranged his entire business schedule to be present. He sat in the armchair, one daughter on his lap, while Eleanor, with the other nestled beside her, read fairy tales. Their voices intertwined, his deep and calm, hers sweet and expressive, creating a world of magic that kept any nightmare at bay. The twins slept soundly, no longer clinging to Elena for security, but each in her own bed, certain that the love surrounding them was solid and permanent. Elena flourished. The insecurity that made her tiptoe around gave way to serene confidence. She was no longer the nanny, but the soul of the house. With Rick's help, she brought her brother to the city, ensuring he received the treatment and guidance he needed to rebuild his life. She enrolled in a gardening course, and the previously perfectly manicured but lifeless garden transformed into an oasis of colorful flowers and aromatic herbs. She filled it with life, just as she had done with the family. Rick, in turn, underwent the most impactful transformation. The man hardened by the business world, who viewed life through the lens of profit and assets, learned to measure wealth differently. He discovered that the biggest dividend he could receive was a smile from his daughters, and the most profitable investment was the time he spent with the woman he loved. He did not abandon his empire, but he put it into perspective. His capital now served a greater purpose, providing security and happiness to his family and helping others discreetly and meaningfully, guided by the compassion he had learned from Elena. One sunny spring afternoon, the four of them were in the garden. The girls chased butterflies, their dresses fluttering in the wind. Rick watched the scene. Standing next to Elena, he took her hand, interlacing their fingers. "Remember when you told me you wanted to see the ocean?" he asked. She smiled. "I remember. I've been thinking," he continued. "I don't think we need to go anywhere. You brought the ocean to us. You brought the calm, the depth, and an infinite horizon of possibilities." In that instant, there was no millionaire and former nanny. There was only a man and a woman, a father and a mother who, against all odds, had found in each other the missing piece to complete the puzzle of their lives. The mansion, once a castle haunted by suffering, was now a sanctuary of love, a testament that true fortune is not found in the assets we accumulate, but in the human connection that, with courage and forgiveness, we managed to build.